I think I speak for everyone when I say that I've seen Fantasia many times, and it's a masterpiece. Even up to today's standards, it has stood the test of times as being one of the best and memorable films, and has not surprisingly become another Disney movie on Blu-ray hard to achieve at online auctions like eBay. And even if one does acquire a copy of it on Blu-ray, I can guarantee that it won't be as much as the original retail price, and you'd be surprised how many people fight for these Disney movies, no matter what format they're on. That's how the Disney Vault market scheme gets you, unless if you're a pirate. Because of the popular VHS re-release of Fantasia commemorating the 50th anniversary in 1991, a video game adaptation was made and released for the Sega Genesis to tie in with the release, following the success of Castle of Illusion. The game is not surprisingly focused on the Sorcerer's Apprentice and incorporates elements from the film into the gameplay. You take control as Mickey and your objective is to collect various music notes that were stolen mysteriously. I'm going to assume that it's the Chernobog, and I guess Mickey fell asleep on the job again. Now that should be all set for you since the concept is odd, but pretty well thought out. But this is only a prelude of things to come. The visuals in the game are presented very well, although dated by today's standards, but upon its release, it was quite a looker. The sprites are fairly big with nice details added to them. Anyone that has seen the film will instantly recognize many characters, from the marching broomsticks to the enchanted dancing mushrooms. Pretty much every character from the film are here. The developers seem pretty keen to make everything look attractive and detailed on the sprites and with the levels. Even with characters that only appeared briefly in the movie have a nice touch, such as the flaming ghost heads from Bald Mountain. And no, this Black Centaur Sunflower is not in this game whatsoever. The levels are well made out, reflecting the setting of each piece from the film. Well, for the most part, as a few settings never made it into the game, but the layout design of the levels are terrible, and I'll explain why as we go on. The music is a mixed bag in Fantasia. On one hand, Sega actually bothered to shell out some extra cash to obtain rights to use the music from the film for the game. On the other hand, because of the limited capabilities of the audio system on the Genesis, the quality of each track sounds quite awful, and it's not entirely the fault of the developers, as the Genesis sound system wasn't the strongest, and what you end up with in this game are a bunch of scrambled tunes trying so hard to sound like that of the film. Tracks such as Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite and Beethoven's Pastoral Sympathy don't even sound remotely like that of their original compositions. In fact, you would never notice these tracks were from Fantasia unless you listened very carefully. But even listening to it is pretty annoying, as they're composed out of bleeps and bloops, and if you're listening to them through headsets, it can give you quite a migraine that you wish there was an option to not have music on, especially of how bad Night on Bald Mountain sounds, and makes you wish this game was released on the Super NES. And if you listen to a 16-bit Super NES rendition of the piece, which does exist, you'll come to the conclusion that the soundtrack would have sounded much better then. The sound effects are just as annoying and hardly worth mentioning, especially with the sound of whenever you take damage and die. Even with the gripes I have of the music, that could all be forgiven, and the nice visuals and the concept of playing Mickey in the world of Fantasia would rival that of Aladdin on the Genesis. Sadly, what really kills this game are the horrific controls and unforgiving gameplay. Simply put, this game has one of the most loathsome control schemes I've ever tried to contend with. First of all, Mickey is slow, and when I say that, I mean he's really slow. No matter which direction you walk, Mickey feels the need to drag his pacing, and this can get you damaged by enemies you're trying to evade. Jumping is even worse, as most of the game requires you to jump constantly. The problem with that is not only are the level environments poorly made for maneuvering, but the jumping is really delayed that it allows your enemies to get in cheap hits before you take off. Even the hang time is extremely awkward, as you're given little to no control of where Mickey goes or lands, and this can result in numerous lives lost, and even run into enemies in the air. The swimming controls are no better, as Mickey is no Echo, and because of how many enemies are swimming around, taking minimal damage is impossible. It's not as bad as Donald Land, but still a nightmare. Where the controls really falters is attacking. You're given two ways to take out enemies. One way is to use your magic powers, like casting bubble projectiles toward enemies, and this can be effective to some extent, but the issue with this is that your spell takes up a huge amount of magic that you only have enough shots for at least 3 spells, and whenever you do cast them, you freeze momentarily and the projectiles only spring forward as opposed to any other direction, making the spells at most point useless, and once again, it can give enemies much chances uses to take you out. And you wonder how Mickey is performing magic on his own when in no time during the game does he wear the magical hat. The other way of attacking is jumping on the enemies, similar to Super Mario Bros. The main issue with this is that you can't just jump on an enemy and expect them to vanish like in most platformers. Instead, you have to press down slightly before you make contact. Otherwise, you'll not only kill the enemy, but take damage in the process. And due to the poor collision detection, you need to be cautiously accurate of where you land, as even the slightest inch off your mark can affect you. Games like Mr. Nuts was pretty anal of where on the enemy's head you landed on in order to kill them, but at least it was simple enough to do. Fantasia in its way of attacking will give players an aggravating time managing the simplest command, even for enemies that require more than one hit to kill. The gameplay is extremely appalling. As mentioned, you have to collect as many music notes as possible while traversing your way through obstacles and enemies that are ridiculously overblown that it would be near impossible to do a no-hit run, especially with terrible hit and collision detection, which are some of the worst I've ever seen. Not only are a majority of the enemies relentless, but the characters' infogrames made into enemies is questionable. The dancing mushrooms, walking cactuses, the ballerina flowers, dancing hippos, little flying horses, ostriches. It's like literally every character from the film are enemies in the game, except for those that we want to see. Spoiler alert, the Chernobog is nowhere to be found, not even as the final boss. It wouldn't be until years later in Kingdom Hearts where we actually face the Chernobog. Some of these enemies respawn in very sadistic areas, especially when you move forward, as they will all of a sudden appear with no warning. Traversing your way through each level is a huge chore. It's not as simple as getting to the end, as there will be times where you'll come across forks in the road where a fairy appears to take you to a different part of the level, and more often than not, some areas will randomly teleport you further back, making you go through the shit you've already haggled with before. This game also loves to be as cryptic as possible with hidden objects and items, as there are a lot of random things to find, and they're never apparent to the eye. You either have to get a good sense of the layouts or find them by accident and follow from there. If you can't find much of these hidden items, your magic won't be of much use, and the magic orbs are scarce. The collision detection can screw you over so much, as many platforms seem solid, but if you don't land on them right, you'll fall through, alongside with surfaces that you would never think you could stand on, like parts of water. When it comes to gathering music notes, the game works similar to that of RoboCop 2 on the NES, where if you don't collect enough nukes, you're sent to the shooting range, and if you fail, you have to start the previous level from the beginning. In Fantasia, it's no different. If you don't collect enough notes, you have to go through the whole previous level again until you've collected an acceptable amount. There's nothing more brutal than to repeat a horrendous level that you've died on so many times, all for your efforts to be rejected. It's like taking a road test at the DMV. You're managing all of the skills well and obeying the traffic, but there will be times when the tester decides to throw in unexpected tasks that were not even scripted, and if you can't get through properly, you pretty much failed the test. I hardly use cheat codes in any of my reviews, especially on an actual game capture, but in the case of this one, I had to use the Game Genie just to show off all the levels, as it proved to be too difficult for me on my own legitimacy. The difficulty is unforgiving and nauseating. Strangely enough, there is a difficulty setting, but no matter which mode you play on, nothing changes within its toughness. The only difference is the amount of notes you need to collect, which is literally like pouring salt and rusted nails on a deep cut. And all of the footage you see was played on the easiest mode. With what I've experienced while playing Fantasia, I'm gonna go on record saying that this is one of the worst platformers I've ever played, and certainly one of the worst games I've played on the Genesis thus far. And yes, I have played Bubsy, and its controls is something I can work with. When I first heard about this game, I was fairly excited to experience the magic of Fantasia in 16-bit. Hearing so much negative things about it, I wanted to see if people were off on what they said, and after playing this, they weren't exaggerating. This is a game that no one should have to play ever again. Although I never played this game as a kid, I'm sure many of you recall such frustration. Imagine being a kid and you so desperately wanted a Disney game for the Genesis, like Aladdin or Castle of Illusion, and in response, you got this. The disappointment would have been unforgiving, and no amount of Disney magic would be enough to fix the emotional toll. As always, thank you for watching. I'm Riley Sky, and until next time, take care.